Hey friends, today we're diving into an interview with economist Thomas Sowell. Now before you start sharpening your political pitchforks, remember, the goal here is to listen first, react second. We're going to pause, unpack, and maybe laugh a little along the way. You don't have to agree with Thomas, but you do have to admit the man can drop a spicy fact bomb.
Economic Facts and Fallacies, quote, "Some things are believed because they are demonstrably true, but many other things are believed simply because they have been asserted repeatedly," close quote. You wish to let that gloomy observation on human nature stand?
Yes.
All right, starting strong. Sowell says some things are believed because they're true, and others because they've been repeated a lot. Sound familiar? Yeah, all of us have been guilty of that. This is basically the political version of hearing a TikTok short so many times you start quoting it without even knowing the context. Let's see how he applies that to housing.
The biggest economic fallacy about housing is that affordable housing requires government intervention, close quote. Now, Tom, I have to remonstrate with you. No poor person would be able to live on the island of Manhattan or in the city of San Francisco if there weren't rent control or subsidized low-income housing that these cities forced builders to set aside when they built their high-rises for rich people. Isn't that manifestly true?
No, it's not even remotely true.
All right, explain. Explain.
Well, first history. There were more people, I believe, living in Manhattan prior to the rise of rent control and prior to the rise of government housing projects. My gosh, at one time, the Lower East Side of New York was the most tightly packed place in the world.
So he just said it's not even remotely true that affordable housing needs government intervention. Bold move. Could we just hear Thomas out before throwing tomatoes?
New York and San Francisco have very long rent control laws, old ones and severe ones. And yet when you look at the cities with the highest rents in the country, of any major cities, they are number one, New York, and number two, San Francisco.
So what's going on?
Well,
Why does the political system produce a perverse outcome, which is then supported in the press? Try to mention a repeal of rent control, and the New York Times will go after you immediately.
Absolutely. What happens in rent control around the world, really, because it's been tried so many times, is that people, if the rent control is severe, the people either reduce the amount of housing they build, or they stop building housing altogether. And so what happens, the political authorities are then confronted with a situation. Do you want to have a situation where there's no new housing built and the old housing is wearing out, usually faster under rent control, because the landlords don't have to keep it up as much. And so they step in and they'll have some kind of modification so that, well, let's say we're trying to protect the poor, so we won't regulate luxury housing. Of course, luxury housing and ordinary housing use much of the same labor, the same materials. And so therefore, all the materials that would otherwise have gone into making ordinary housing goes into building luxury housing.
So here's a translation. Rent control sounds nice, but if you make it unprofitable to build housing, people stop building housing. Imagine running a lemonade stand where you're only allowed to sell for half the cost of your lemons. Cute idea. Until the lemons are gone and your stand turns into a planter.
If we go back to the beginning of the 20th century, before government intervention became pervasive in housing markets, we find, and this is to me one of the most arresting assertions in the book, we find people paying a smaller percentage of their expenditures for housing than at the end of the 20th century. In 1901, housing costs took 23% of the average American family's spending. By 2003, it took 33% of a far larger amount of spending. What's going on?
What's going on is that they're restricting the amount of housing that can be built. And obviously, if you restrict the supply while the demand is growing, the prices will go up through the roof.
Cui bono? Who benefits from this arrangement?
Politicians most of all,
How?
because they get the reputation of being for the poor and the downtrodden, and that they're setting aside affordable housing units, usually in some token amounts. They are preventing the evil landlords from raising the rent by rent control, and if they are able to keep the public paranoid that if they take off the rent control, it'll be just sky-high prices, and so they gain by that. Both the landlords and the tenants lose. They lose in different ways and to different extents. The tenants lose because they can't find a place to stay. The landlords lose because they don't make the profit they would have made otherwise. The builders lose because there's no demand for apartment buildings if nobody can make a profit on it.
All right.
And now, Houston versus coastal California. The no zoning cowboy versus the permit purgatory coastline. He's basically saying, more rules, fewer houses, higher prices, not a left or right point. Just an economy 101 supply and demand concept.
Economic facts and fallacies once again. Quote, where builders are allowed to construct homes and apartments without severe government restrictions, even growing populations and rising incomes do not cause housing prices to shoot up because the supply of newly constructed housing keeps up with the growing demand, as in Houston. Now, would you please contrast Houston with our own coastal California?
Oh my goodness, there couldn't be a greater
give you an easy one.
Yes, that's an easy one. Houston doesn't even have zoning laws, whereas to build anything in coastal California is just an ordeal. I mean, you have to not only you have to go through all kinds of planning commissions. I've had the misfortune of sitting in on 2 planning commission meetings. I don't know what it did for my blood pressure watching these people. The discouragement is huge. So someone estimated, for example, a real estate company, that a house that would cost $155,000 in Houston would cost $1 million in San Francisco.
Right.
The same house.
Now, but Tom, what about a place like Las Vegas, which overbuilt dramatically, and now there are it's going to take who knows how many years for the already in-place housing stock in Las Vegas to get purchased. Meanwhile, of course, it's declining. We could have used a little regulation there, couldn't we?
Well, the regulation was one of the problems. I don't think it's going to take years, unless the government intervenes as it has to keep the prices from falling. The people who own the empty houses have every incentive to rent the houses for whatever they can get. Whether that's, I had the very same problem here on the Stanford campus when I moved away, that I didn't sell my house immediately, and so I rented it out. And I rented it out for an amount that was $100 a month less than the mortgage payment, because the alternative would be to have it sit empty and pay the whole mortgage payment myself.
Segment 2, race and economics. Economic facts and fallacies. Quote, few subjects produce more fallacies than race. Among these fallacies are that, now get ready, I'm going to give you a passage here. Race was the basis of slavery, that racism is the main reason for black-white differences in incomes, and in all the other aspects of life that depend on income. Moreover, there is often an implicit assumption that racism and discrimination are so closely linked that they go up or down together. Now, what you have produced is a handful of outrages, and we'll take them one at a time. How's that? Race wasn't the basis of slavery?
Oh, it's a simple historical matter. Slavery existed for thousands of years, as far back as there are any records of human beings. Archaeological finds suggest that slavery existed before human beings could read and write. So, a racial difference between the slaves and the enslavers, that is a relatively new phenomenon. You didn't have in ancient times the ability to go to another continent and move millions of people of a different race across the ocean. So you enslaved the people who were nearby. The Europeans enslaved Slavs for centuries before they brought the first black African to the Western Hemisphere.
First bombshell, slavery wasn't originally about race. The way he explains it, race became the U.S. justification for slavery because we had that awkward all men are created equal thing in our founding documents and still wanted slavery. Hypocrisy level historical.
You do not wish to say anything other than that slavery as practiced in the United States was, it may have been recent, but you'd be willing to grant that it was particularly perverse and destructive because race got mixed into it at that point, right?
Race got mixed into it in the United States more than anywhere else for a very simple reason. The United States was founded, as the Declaration said, of independence, said all men are created equal.
Right.
If that's true, then the only way you can justify slavery is to say that some men are less than men.
I see. So the racial component...
But in Brazil, where Brazil imported more slaves than the United States, there was no such ideology. Brazil was not a democratic country. The whole issue never arose.
I see. I see. All right. Race doesn't account for differences in black-white income?
No, the differences between income between Western Europeans and Eastern Europeans is greater than the difference between blacks and whites in the United States. Differences in income are the rule. They are not the exception.
So, looking at all these sociological studies that show a persistent gap between African Americans in income and every other form of American in income is what? Useless? It tells us things that we don't need to know? It misleads us? How would you describe that?
Wrong, I think, sums it up. It is not true. Hispanics have a lower per capita income than blacks. Hispanic households and families have a higher income than black households and families, simply because the Hispanic families are larger.
Okay. Now, this last assertion, race and discrimination, you suggest, are not so closely linked that they move up and down together. First of all, distinguish the two, race and discrimination.
Racism is an attitude inside people's heads.
Right.
Discrimination is an overt act taking place outside in the real world.
Okay.
So not only with blacks, but you find the same thing with Jews in previous centuries, that part of the United States where there was the most racism against blacks, namely the South,
right,
is where black construction workers were much more common than they were in the North, right on into the 20th century. Most people are unaware that in the South, blacks were the construction workers. I remember a professor at Howard University saying that when he was a boy in the South, his father pointed to some man on the street and said, he was the first white construction worker in this town.
And so what was going on there? The racism did not, so whites could think of blacks as somehow or other separate, but they'd still employ them because the market made it profitable to do so.
Yeah, in fact, yes. In fact, a law had to be passed to stop this because in the 20s, and particularly as the Depression got underway, black construction companies in the South using black non-union labor would come up to the North and underbid on government contracts, taking them away. And so this was very common, to the point where they passed the Davis-Bacon Act, which said that on government contracts you must pay the prevailing wage, which translated almost invariably into the union wage.
Right. So your point on the distinction between racism and discrimination is, don't worry about racism. It's inside people's heads. You can't measure it. There's a strongly subjective, just forget about it, concentrate only on discrimination. And the best answer to discrimination is to let markets operate, because then people will discover, it will tend to militate against discrimination.
Yes,
when people have skills to offer, they'll be employed. Whatever this notion of racism in people's heads is, don't worry about that. Is that right?
Yeah, what I'm saying essentially is that racists may prefer one race to another, but they prefer themselves to everybody else.
So they'll do what's profitable.
That's right. That's right.
Got it.
And
Okay.
that was even true in South Africa under apartheid, that there were hundreds of construction companies in South Africa that were fined in a government crackdown because they were hiring more blacks and in higher positions than they were allowed to under the apartheid law, because that was where the money was.
All right.
Here's the hot take. Racism is an attitude. Discrimination is an action. He's saying markets can sometimes push back on discrimination because money doesn't care about your bias if hiring someone makes you more profit. Now, whether you buy that or not, it's an interesting flip on the usual narrative.
Segment 3, race and culture, economic facts and fallacies. A fallacy is that the current fatherless families so prevalent among contemporary blacks are a legacy of slavery, where families were not recognized under slavery. This ignores the fact that the problem has become much worse among generations of blacks far removed from slavery than among generations closer to the era of slavery, close quote. Explain that.
You mean explain why it is so, or
Yes, see, why is that? Why? What on earth is going on there? That is so counter to what we assume.
Well, first of all, the people, most people have not recognized the fact that if you go back into the 20s, you find that married couple families were much more prevalent among blacks then than today. You find also, incidentally, that the blacks had, as late as 1930, blacks had lower unemployment rates than whites. So all these things that we complain about and attribute to the era of slavery, those things should have been worse in the past than in the present.
Right.
But in fact, they're worse in the present than in the past. And I think if you want to look for a turning point, it would be since the 1960s.
And what happened in the 1960s?
Oh, you began to have not only the welfare state, you began to have the mindset that goes with the welfare state, so that there was no stigma any longer attached, for example, to being on relief or welfare.
Okay, this one will ruffle feathers. He says, fatherlessness in black families got worse long after slavery ended, especially since the 1960s, and links it more to the welfare state than to slavery. Even if you don't agree with that cause, the data trend itself is worth looking at. Sometimes we react to the why before we even check the what.
And so, but why? Well, illegitimacy is exploding now among, it's high among Hispanics,
Yes.
and it's exploding among whites. But the Moynihan report, when was that, Tom?
Oh, in the 60s, 64, 65.
When Moynihan talked about the illegitimacy rate among blacks, which was exploding then. So what if the welfare state changes the way Americans think?
Yes.
Why did black Americans prove susceptible to that change first?
Because they were poor. I don't think that many Asian American girls who are preparing to go off to Stanford or Harvard are going to say, hey, I can live on welfare, why should I abstain?
So it's nothing to do with slavery, or at least it's less to do with slavery than it is to do with what with what we have willfully constructed since. Once again, crime. Once again, economic facts and fallacies. The history of crime and violence among blacks contradicts many widespread beliefs about the causes. Crime among black Americans, like crime among white Americans, was declining for years prior to the decade of the 1960s. But it was during the 1960s that crime rates began skyrocketing among both blacks and whites, and it was after the historic civil rights laws were passed that blacks began rioting in cities across the country.
Yes.
Again, this is just, well, actually, not only do you know it, but you relish. You relish how contrarian this is to everything we think we understand. What happens in the 1960s that leads to rioting?
For one thing, the justification of rioting, for one thing, and the holding back of the police. One of the biggest riots in terms of deaths occurred in Detroit. And the governor sent in troops, but he sent them with strict orders to hold off and so on. And once the rioters, who were just a small percentage of the population of the black community, once they saw that the police weren't going to do anything, they ran amok. I contrast that with Chicago, where I still remember the original Mayor Daley coming on television and saying, "I have instructed my police in case of riots to shoot to kill." There was horror across the country. People didn't notice that there were far fewer deaths in Chicago than there were in places where the mayor came on and pleaded with people to behave and said, "I understand your problems," and all of that kind of stuff, none of which stops riots.
Although Detroit, once again, economic facts and fallacies, although Detroit had the worst of the riots, the poverty rate among Detroit's black population was only half of that of blacks nationwide. Its home ownership rate among blacks was the highest in the country, and its unemployment rate was 3.4% lower than among whites nationwide. Detroit did not have a massive riot because it was an economic disaster area. It became an economic disaster area after the riots.
Yes.
So again, what causes these riots? Once they get started, the governor does the wrong thing.
Yes.
But what starts them?
Oh, anything can start a riot. The question is, how do you stop them? And James Q. Wilson once said, the only thing that will stop the riot is overwhelming force on the scene. But you see, if you put overwhelming force on the scene, that will indeed stop the riot cold. But then the next day's newspapers will say, why did the police overreact? I mean, there was just a little disturbance, and here come these tons of cops.
Riots and policing. He basically says a fast, strong police presence stops riots, but that gets you roasted in the press. It's the eternal PR versus public safety tug of war.
Income inequality.
Yes.
Okay, listen to Paul Krugman, your favorite economist. Didn't I hear you say that one?
Not unless I was absolutely on LSD or my mind has gone completely.
All right. Paul Krugman, writing in his New York Times blog, quote, "Since the late 1970s, the America I knew has unraveled." You might be willing to take that as we're no longer a middle-class society in which the benefits of economic growth are widely shared. Between 1979 and 2005, the real income of the median household rose only 13%, but the income of the richest 0.1% of Americans rose 296%, close quote. The rich are not only getting richer, they're becoming dramatically richer, while everybody else is treading water.
I love it. Well, all I have to hear is the word household income, and I know we're not serious.
Why?
Because households differ over time in size. They differ from one group to another in size, and they differ from one income level to another in size. For example, in the bottom 20% of households, there are 39 million people. In the top 20% of households, there are 64 million people. Over time, the households have been declining in size. So if you had a household in which, at some point in the past, there were 3 working adults,
Right.
And now the household has only 2 working adults, and the family is making the same money they always made, that is not stagnation. That is a 50% increase in per capita income, which may be why one of the adults goes off and establishes his own household. He can afford to. So household income are utter nonsense. If you're serious, you look at per capita income, because per capita means one person, and it always means one person. It doesn't mean one person in 1980 and 1.5 persons in 1930, and so it always means one person. So if you're looking for a legitimate comparison, that's what you do. If you're looking to score political points, you go to household income and family income, and voila, you have your political points.
All right. On per capita income, how's the country doing?
I haven't checked the latest figure. I'm sure. I know that in terms of real per capita income, the average income today will buy less than it could last year. I don't usually make predictions, but I suspect it will buy less next year.
He's not impressed with household income stats, says we should look at per-person income instead, kind of like how your group dinner bill looks small, until you realize it's just you and one other friend paying.
Income inequality in women, economic facts and fallacies. Given the numerous factors that impact the incomes and employment of women differently from the way they impact the incomes and employment of men, it can hardly be surprising that there have been substantial income differences between the sexes. Okay, not quite as outrageous as you often are. Here it comes. Nor can all these differences be assumed to be negative on net balance for women. Close quote. Tom, you look at the difference in income between men, higher, women, lower, and you suggest that on average, women may actually be better off, or many women may be better off. You have to explain yourself.
Well, yeah, if you're making comparisons, again, you can't compare apples and oranges. When I was doing research for that particular chapter, I remember being amazed that there was a large difference in income between young male physicians and young female physicians. Until I dug into the data and discovered that young male physicians work more than 500 hours a year more than young female physicians. If you work 500 extra hours, chances are you'll get paid more. And as you go through many of the other differences, you find all kinds of explanations of that sort.
All right.
And the wage gap. He points to hours worked, not just discrimination. Now, we can still ask why women often work fewer hours, childcare, workplace culture, burnout, but his point is about adjusting the math before making conclusions.
The university in contemporary America. Now, don't get misty-eyed. Economic Facts and Fallacies, quote, "In general, the way that higher education is financed, including the nonprofit status of most academic institutions, gives decision makers in academia far greater latitude in deciding what to do than is the case in enterprises whose survival depends on accommodating both those who receive their goods and services and those who supply the money. It is therefore not very surprising that many of the decisions made in the academic world serve the interests of those who make the decisions." Close quote. You've been an academic virtually all your professional life. Let's just begin with the baseline question. If you had it to do over again, would you do it differently?
If I had to, I've thought about that a lot.
Have you really?
Yes, because when
I thought I would be asking you a question that would catch you by surprise.
No.
Hard to do with you, Tom.
During my first month as an undergraduate at Harvard, I received a letter forwarded from Washington offering me a job as a photographer. And I've often thought, if I could go back to that time, would I, in fact, drop out of Harvard and go take the job, or would I continue slogging on? And I'd probably drop out and go take the job.
Would you really?
Yes.
So, academia, there's a corrupting influence here. They get money to a large extent from government, all the student loans, all of it with government. It's redistributing income from ordinary working Joes to fancy professors, fundamentally, is what's going on and has been going on for decades. Correct?
Yeah, and of course to the students.
And to the students.
Who riot when not enough of the taxpayers' money is given to them.
Has academia in America become, I don't even know quite how to ask the question, has it become more irresponsible? Did it reach a low point in the 60s and it's been recovering since? How do you think of it in those terms? Over time?
I think there was a break point in the 60s. I'm not sure it's recovered. I know in the 70s there was a lot of self-congratulation that we no longer have violence on campus. Yes, the campus were quiet, but it was the quiet of surrender. Because people who would cause people to riot were not invited on campuses. People who would antagonize the students by their viewpoints were not hired as professors. One of the reasons why a few years ago when the think tanks of the world were ranked, and Hoover was ranked #1, but most of the leading think tanks in those rankings were conservative think tanks. And I think there's a very simple reason for it. The kinds of top scholars who would normally be in academia were not in academia, and this is one of the places they could go and work with the kind of freedom that academic tenure is supposed to provide, but doesn't.
He's worried that facts are now optional, that kids are being taught to have strong opinions before they're taught to weigh evidence. Hot take? Maybe. But swap kids for Twitter X, and you'll see the same issue.
The prospect for the future. You begin Economic Facts and Fallacies with two quotations. One is the frontispiece for the whole book, and the other heads the first chapter. John Adams, your first quotation. "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." Second quotation, economist Henry Rosovsky. Quote, "Never underestimate the difficulty of changing false beliefs by facts." Close quote. Now here's what throws me, Tom. That first quotation, John Adams, is a fundamentally optimistic quotation. John Adams is, of course, a Democrat. He helps to found the country, and in all his writing, all his life, he has this basic faith that people exposed to the facts and the evidence will come around and assimilate those facts and evidence and make decisions based on them. The second quotation couldn't be more pessimistic. Never underestimate the difficulty of changing false beliefs by facts. So on the scale of optimistic John Adams to pessimistic Henry Rosofsky, where's Tom Sowell?
Well, I'm right there with Henry Rosofsky, or perhaps a little to his right.
Oh, you were supposed to say you're right in the middle. You're way over here. Really?
Yeah, I think that we're raising whole generations who regard facts as more or less optional. You have kids in elementary school who are being urged to take stands on political issues, to write letters to congressmen and presidents about nuclear energy. They're not a decade old, and they're being thrown these kinds of questions that could absorb the lifetime of a very brilliant and learned man. And they're being taught that it's important to have views, and they're not being taught that it's important to know what you're talking about. It's important to hear the opposite viewpoint, and more important, to learn how to distinguish why viewpoint A and viewpoint B are different and which one has the most evidence or logic behind it. They disregard that. They hear something and they hear some rhetoric and they run with it.
This one's personal for Thomas. He says Harlem schools in his childhood beat out many schools today. That's one area where left, right, and center can probably agree. Kids deserve better.
You write a lot about race and economic facts and fallacies, and we've gone through that in this discussion. And frankly, it's heartbreaking.
It is.
We think we've made progress,
Uh-huh.
and the reverse is true in many ways.
Yeah, we've made progress.
Rate,
We've made progress in some respects. We've had painful retrogression. I think in terms of education, there's no question in my mind that kids who grew up where I grew up in Harlem don't get nearly the education that I got when I was growing up there.
Okay, so let me put this question to you with regard to race. John, you remember John Rawls and his famous veil of ignorance.
Oh, yes.
So let's just say that you're an African-American child about to be born. Mm-hmm. Do you choose 1930s America, the year in which you were born, or do you choose America in 2011?
I'm afraid that if you're not born in the South, you would choose in the 1930s.
You would.
In the 1940s, New York had one of the finest public education systems in the country. I came up from Charlotte, North Carolina, where kids from Charlotte.
How old were you when you came up?
9 years old.
Okay, so
Kids were routinely put back a year when they moved from Charlotte to New York. The latest information I have on education is that among the major cities in the country, Charlotte is now #1. New York is way down the list.
So that's Sowell, sometimes sharp, sometimes spicy, always opinionated. You don't have to buy every argument, but it's worth hearing the logic so we can sharpen our own. Agree? Disagree? Let's hear it in the comments. Respectfully, please. And remember this. Facts might be stubborn things, but listening is a choice. And remember this as well. If you like this kind of thoughtful reaction video, let us know by giving us a like and subscribing to Character Driven. Be sure to let us know in the comments what you think of Thomas and his way of seeing the world.